Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're digging into an event that kind of sits awkwardly outside the usual stories we tell about American history.
hmm
We are heading to North Dakota, 1931 specifically, to unpack the state's very last documented lynching.
Yeah, and it's striking because, when you think of organized mob justice, maybe your mind goes to earlier times or different parts of the country.
Right.
But the fact that this pretty highly structured incident happened in the Northern Plains and well into the 20th century, it just confirms that this threat of extra-legal violence was much more widespread and lasted longer than a lot of people might realize.
Absolutely. So our focus today is on Charles Bannon. He was a young guy, 22, a hired hand, and he confessed to something truly horrific,
The murder of the entire Haven family, 6 people.
including a baby, just 2 months old. His lynching, which happened January 29th, 1931, right after his confession, it was brutal.
And what our sources show, and this is what we want to get into, isn't just the shocking violence itself, it's the level of planning behind it.
The organization, yeah. And then the state investigation afterwards, which just fizzled out.
Completely failed, really. And then there's this surprising legislative angle afterwards, this attempt to use the lynching to change the law, which, well, it didn't actually work out.
Okay, so let's unpack all that. We're going to give you the specific details because they really define this major turning point for North Dakota. We'll go from the crime itself right through to the political reaction.
Sounds good. Where do we start? Schaefer, North Dakota.
Let's start there, yeah. New Schaefer, 1930. The Haven family, they were apparently doing okay, described as well off, and then after February 9th, they just vanished. Charles Bannon was their hired hand.
And right away, this is where the cover-up, this long deception begins. Bannon doesn't leave the farm.
No, he stays.
He stays, looks after the animals, tells the neighbors the Havens just picked up and left, and now he's renting the place. He keeps his story going for months. Eventually, his father, James Bannon, even joins him there.
And the neighbors must have thought something was odd, but maybe not criminal at first.
Probably just low-level suspicion for a while. But it really ramps up in the fall of 1930. That's when the Bannons start selling off the Haven family's property, their crops.
Okay, that would do it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
By December, Charles Bannon gets arrested. But interestingly, not for murder initially. It's for grand larceny, stealing the property.
And it's under questioning for that crime that the real story comes out.
That's when it emerges. Charles Bannon confesses to the murders. It's worth noting he actually gave several different statements.
Oh.
Yeah, initially he claimed one child's death was sort of an accident, and then he killed the other 5 because he was afraid of being found out.
Wow.
And in those first confessions, he kept saying his father, James, wasn't involved in the actual killings, that he was innocent of that part.
But the authorities were clearly not entirely convinced about the father's innocence.
No, because James Bannon was tracked down pretty quickly out in Oregon. They arrested him and brought him back as alleged accomplice in the whole thing.
Okay, so that's the core crime. But you mentioned something earlier that makes this even more charged.
Right. This is where it gets really interesting. It connects the Haven killings to this sort of background anxiety in the community. Later on, newspaper articles, and there's a book called End of the Rope about this, they detail all this speculation that was apparently widespread at the time.
Speculation about what?
That Charles Bannon might have been responsible for another terrible event years before. A house fire back in 1925.
Oh, wow. Another family.
Yes, the Amlian family. Also in McKenzie County, that fire killed 4 of their children. Ages 14, 12, 8, and 5, Karen Julia, George, Elmer, and Jenny.
And Bannon knew them.
He'd worked for the Amlian family, too.
So wait, the community isn't just reacting to this one horrific murder of the Havens. They might be thinking, this guy got away with killing kids years ago.
Exactly. They're potentially connecting dots, seeing him not just as a killer, but maybe as someone who'd been a danger for years, undetected, unpunished.
That kind of fear, that perception of a long-term menace, you can see how that would just pour fuel on the fire for wanting, immediate justice, not waiting for the courts.
It absolutely provided let's say, the emotional justification for what happened next. In their eyes, they weren't just dealing with a recent crime, they were dealing with a monster the system had possibly missed before.
Which brings us to the lynching itself, and you said it was highly organized.
Very. So Bannon had been held in Williston in a more secure jail, but then January 23rd, 1931, they move him back to the local jail in Schaefer, which was much, much easier to get into.
And why move him?
Officially, it was for his arraignment on the 6 murder charges. Both Charles and his father, James, were put in that Schaefer jail.
A decision that turned out to be fatal.
Incredibly so. Just 6 days later, January 29th, really early morning, between 12:30 and 1 a.m., the mob shows up. And like you said, this wasn't some spontaneous, angry crowd.
Yeah.
The sources really emphasize this.
Mm-hmm.
It was like a well-oiled machine. Over 75 men. More than 15 cars involved. This points to serious pre-planning, coordination, discipline.
And they knew exactly what they were doing.
Totally. They were efficient. First, they wake up the sheriff, Cyber Thompson, grab him right away, take him out of the picture.
Get him out of the way.
Right. Then they just systematically start taking the jail apart, break down the main door. They take the deputy, a guy named Hallen, away as well. And then finally, they smash down the door to Bannon's cell.
And Bannon himself.
Amidst all that chaos, there's this one really strange, sort of chilling human detail. When the mob finally gets to him, Bannon apparently surrendered immediately. But the only thing he asked this huge group of armed men was, "Don't harm my father."
Wow. They ignored that, presumably.
They ignored the plea, yeah. Dragged him out. He already had a noose around his neck. Their first idea was quite symbolic, actually.
Where were they going?
They planned to hang him right there on the Haven family farm, the scene of the murders.
But that didn't happen.
Nope. The person taking care of the farm at the time basically stood his ground, threatened to shoot if they came onto the property.
So they changed plans.
Quickly averted that confrontation, yeah. They found another spot just half a mile away. It was this new bridge, Cherry Creek Bridge, a high bridge built just the summer before.
And that's where they hanged him.
That's where they did it. And the sheer professionalism, if you can call it that, was noted later. The investigation found that whoever tied the hangman's knot really knew what they were doing. It wasn't clumsy work.
Expert knowledge, the report said.
Yeah, it suggests this was a calculated, skilled execution, not just random violence.
So the lynching is done, but obviously the story doesn't end there. The big question then becomes, what's the state going to do? This massive breakdown of law and order.
Right. And the public outcry, or at least the official outcry, was significant enough that the governor, George F. Schaefer, he called for an immediate, high-level investigation.
And who did he put in charge?
He appointed James Morris, who was the state attorney general at the time. And it's important, like you said, to know who Morris was. This wasn't just any politician.
Right. You mentioned his later career.
Yeah, he goes on to become a state Supreme Court justice. And even later, he served as a judge at the Nuremberg war crimes trials after World War II. So we're talking about someone with really serious legal and ethical standing leading this investigation.
Okay, so a heavyweight investigator. What did he find? Did he confirm the organization?
He did. Morris quickly concluded the lynching was carefully planned, controlled by, he thought, at least 3 people who were clearly in charge. He noted that professional knot. He even looked into, like, a possible manufacturer's mark on the rope itself. He treated it very seriously, like a major crime investigation.
So all this effort, this high-profile investigator, what was the result? Did they catch anyone?
And this is the stunning part. 0. Absolutely nothing. Despite Morris's efforts, despite his reputation, not a single member of that mob out of more than 75 known participants was ever officially identified, let alone arrested.
Wait, hold on. How is that possible? A future Supreme Court justice investigating a public lynching involving dozens of people in a small community finds clear evidence of planning and identifies no one.
It speaks volumes, doesn't it, about the social and political reality there at the time. Morris himself, pretty quickly, like within a week, basically concluded that actually identifying the attackers was going to be impossible.
Why? A cover-up?
Essentially, yeah. A wall of silence. The reality in these situations, especially in smaller, tight-knit rural communities, is that when mob justice happens, it often has, well, if not active support, then at least silent approval from a large part of the community.
So nobody would talk?
Nobody talked. The investigation just slammed into this collective silence, maybe even sympathy for the lynchers. Didn't matter how good the investigator was, and they weren't getting anywhere locally.
And that failure, that lack of accountability, must have drawn criticism from outside.
Oh, absolutely. There was a Federal Council of Churches investigation that same summer, and their findings were echoed later in a study from 1990. Both basically put a lot of the blame squarely on the authorities.
For what? For not catching the mob?
Partly, but more for setting the stage. Their conclusion was pretty blunt. The state made a huge error putting Bannon in that low-security Schaefer jail. They argued it basically invited mob violence. And they look wider, too, with the history in North Dakota. They noted that historically, victims of lynchings there just weren't protected by state officials. They suggested this wasn't just a one-off mistake, but maybe part of a bigger systemic issue.
Okay, so the lynching investigation goes nowhere. But what about the original crime? What happened to Bannon's father, James? He was still in jail.
Right. The official justice system kept moving for him. James Bannon was tried separately for his alleged role in the Haven murders. That trial was held in Divide County.
And the outcome?
He was convicted. June 29th, 1931. Sentenced to life in prison. It seems clear that even if people in the community doubted he physically killed anyone, they definitely believed he was guilty of the cover-up.
Helping his sons, selling the property, keeping the secret.
Exactly. Another future Supreme Court Justice, Alvin C. Strutz, noted that feeling was pretty strong. James Bannon was eventually paroled, though, much later, in 1950 when he was 76 years old.
Okay, now let's get to what you called the central analytic point, the legislative reaction. This feels crucial.
It really is. Because immediately after the lynching, a state senator, James P. Cain, he sees an opportunity. He jumps on this event to push for a really major legal change in North Dakota.
Which was?
Reinstating capital punishment.
Right.
North Dakota had actually gotten rid of the death penalty decades earlier.
So Cain used the lynching to argue for bringing it back.
Precisely. His argument was basically this. The mob lynched Bannon because the state didn't have a death penalty. If Bannon had been facing execution legally, Cain argued, the mob wouldn't have felt the need to act.
So the mob wasn't acting against the law, in his view, but sort of completing it, fulfilling the justice the state was too weak to deliver.
That was the framing. The mob's violence was presented as a direct result of the legislature's failure to provide the ultimate punishment.
That's a potent argument that lack of harsh punishment leads to chaos. But you said earlier it didn't work. The Senate rejected the bill.
Rejected it. And that rejection, that's the real twist here, the deep irony we need to focus on. The bill failed. It was close, mind you, a 28-21 vote.
Still, it failed.
It failed. Think about that. The most extreme act of mob violence carried out, supposedly to demand the death penalty, the state wouldn't provide that very act, failed to convince a majority in the Senate to actually change the law and bring it back.
What does that tell us then? Why did it fail, even if it was close? Were they just refusing to be bullied by a lynch mob?
It suggests that the legislature, while maybe they understood the public outrage, they ultimately drew a line. They seemed willing to kind of let the lack of arrests for the lynching slide, not push too hard against that wall of silence.
Right.
But they refused to actually change the state's fundamental penal code because a mob demanded it through violence. The lynching was seen as maybe a breakdown of order that needed controlling, not as a political mandate they had to follow.
So institutional resistance held, despite the pressure.
It did, though the narrow vote shows the debate must have been incredibly intense. But in the end, the state held on to its existing stance against state-sanctioned killing.
And this whole story, even though it's from 1931, it hasn't entirely faded away.
No, it still resonates.
Yeah.
Just last year, actually, 2023, these events were turned into a movie, End of the Rope. So this chapter of North Dakota's history is still being discussed.
Which is important because the details are pretty stark. So the synthesis here, the key things we want you, the listener, to really grasp are: first, this wasn't some spontaneous riot. It was a planned, sophisticated act of mob justice, likely fueled by this deep-seated fear of Bannon as maybe a serial threat and frustration with the system.
Right. Second, the official investigation was a complete failure. Nobody held accountable for the lynching, which really highlights how much complicity or at least silent acceptance there might have been in the community.
And third, that failure and the brutality itself led directly to this major political fight over the death penalty.
A fight that, crucially, the pro-death penalty side lost, despite having the lynching as their prime exhibit.
So the final thought we want to leave you with is this. Consider the argument that the lack of capital punishment supposedly caused the lynching. Yet the lynching itself wasn't enough to bring capital punishment back. What does that whole sequence tell us about the limits of mob influence versus the state's formal power, even back in the 1930s?
Yeah, it makes you wonder, can an act of violent, illegal justice ever really force lasting legal change? Or does it ultimately just make the state dig in its heels to keep control over punishment, no matter what some part of the public thinks? Something to mull over.
Definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the sources.
We'll see you next time.